The morning sun cast long shadows across the Hamilton County Courthouse as Judge Margaret Whitfield adjusted her black robes and prepared for what she expected to be another routine day. At 58, she had spent nearly 2 decades on the bench, building a reputation that was both feared and respected. Her sharp tongue and quick wit had become legendary in legal circles, often reducing seasoned attorneys to nervous wrecks with a single cutting remark. Today's docket included a high-profile case that had drawn significant media attention. The courtroom was packed with reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers who had come to witness what many believed would be a straightforward proceeding. At the center of the controversy was a legal challenge involving campaign finance violations that had connections to several prominent political figures, including Ohio's junior senator J.D. Vance. Judge Whitfield had never been one to shy away from the spotlight. Throughout her career, she had cultivated an image of being tough, uncompromising, and willing to speak her mind, regardless of the political consequences. Her colleagues often described her as brilliant but ruthless, with a particular disdain for what she perceived as political grandstanding and media manipulation. As the morning progressed, the case began to unfold in ways that revealed deep connections between various political operatives and questionable financial arrangements. The evidence presented painted a complex web of relationships and transactions that stretched back several years. What had initially appeared to be a simple violation of campaign finance laws was beginning to reveal itself as something much more substantial and far-reaching. During a brief recess, Judge Whitfield noticed the growing number of reporters in her courtroom. The presence of national media outlets indicated that this case had implications far beyond the local jurisdiction. She had always prided herself on her ability to handle high-pressure situations with grace and authority, and today would be no different. When the proceedings resumed, the lead prosecutor began presenting evidence that directly implicated several political figures in a scheme to circumvent campaign finance regulations. Among the names mentioned was J.D. Vance, whose political rise had been meteoric and whose connections to various financial interests had long been a subject of speculation and investigation. Judge Whitfield listened intently as the prosecutor outlined the allegations. The evidence suggested a coordinated effort to funnel money through various organizations and individuals in order to avoid federal reporting requirements. The scheme was sophisticated, involving multiple layers of transactions and carefully orchestrated timing to maximize impact while minimizing legal exposure. As the day wore on, it became clear that this case would likely have significant ramifications for several high-profile political careers. The courtroom atmosphere was tense, with attorneys on both sides carefully choosing their words and strategies. Every statement, every objection, and every ruling would be scrutinized by the media and could potentially influence public opinion and future elections. Judge Whitfield had always believed that the law should be applied equally, regardless of political affiliation or public status. She had built her career on the principle that justice was blind and that her courtroom would be a place where truth and evidence prevailed over politics and influence. However, the current case was testing these principles in ways she had never experienced before. The afternoon session brought more revelations as additional evidence was presented. Financial records, email communications, and testimony from key witnesses began to paint a picture of systematic abuse of campaign finance laws. The scope of the alleged violations was staggering, involving millions of dollars and dozens of individuals and organizations across multiple states. As Judge Whitfield processed the information being presented, she began to form preliminary opinions about the strength of the prosecution's case. The evidence appeared compelling, and the legal arguments were well constructed. However, she was also aware that high-profile cases like this one often involved complex legal and political considerations that could complicate even the most straightforward proceedings. The defense team, led by some of the most expensive and experienced attorneys in the country, was clearly prepared for a lengthy and contentious battle. Their preliminary statement suggested they would challenge not only the specific allegations, but also the broader legal framework under which the charges had been brought. They argued that their clients were the victims of political persecution, and that the case was more about settling political scores than pursuing justice. As the first day of proceedings drew to a close, Judge Whitfield reflected on the significance of the case before her. The allegations, if proven true, would represent one of the largest campaign finance scandals in recent memory. The potential consequences for those involved could include substantial fines, criminal charges, and the effective end of promising political careers. The media attention surrounding the case was unlike anything she had experienced in her career. National news networks were providing live coverage, and legal analysts were offering commentary on every development. Social media was buzzing with speculation and commentary from political observers, legal experts, and ordinary citizens who were following the case closely. Judge Whitfield had always prided herself on her ability to remain focused on the law and the evidence, regardless of external pressures. However, the current case was presenting challenges that went far beyond the typical legal and procedural issues she normally encountered. The intersection of law, politics, and media was creating a dynamic environment where every decision would be subject to intense scrutiny and potential criticism. As she prepared to leave the courthouse that evening, Judge Whitfield was confident in her ability to handle whatever challenges the case might present. She had faced difficult situations before and had always maintained her integrity and commitment to justice. Tomorrow would bring new developments, new evidence, and new challenges, but she was prepared to meet them with the same professionalism and dedication that had defined her career. The second day of proceedings began with an unexpected development that would change the entire trajectory of the case. As Judge Whitfield entered her courtroom, she noticed an unusually large crowd of reporters and spectators. The overnight news coverage had intensified public interest, and it seemed that everyone wanted to witness what many were calling the most important political trial of the decade. The morning session focused on testimony from key witnesses who had been involved in the alleged campaign finance scheme. Their accounts provided detailed insights into how the operation had been structured and who had been responsible for various aspects of the plan. The testimony was damaging to several of the defendants, including connections that directly implicated J.D. Vance's political organization. As witness after witness took the stand, a pattern began to emerge that painted a picture of systematic abuse of campaign finance laws. The scheme appeared to have been carefully planned and executed over several years, involving coordination between multiple political organizations, donors, and intermediaries. The level of sophistication suggested that this was not a case of accidental violations, but rather a deliberate attempt to circumvent legal restrictions. Judge Whitfield listened carefully to each testimony, taking detailed notes and asking clarifying questions when necessary. She was particularly interested in understanding the timeline of events and how the various participants had communicated and coordinated their activities. The evidence being presented was complex, but it was beginning to form a coherent narrative that supported the prosecution's allegations. During a mid-morning break, Judge Whitfield was approached by her bailiff, who informed her that there had been several unusual phone calls to the court's administrative office. Apparently, various political figures and their representatives were attempting to gather information about the proceedings and, in some cases, expressing concern about the direction the case was taking. When the session resumed, the prosecution presented what they claimed was their most damaging evidence: a series of recorded phone conversations between key participants in the alleged scheme. The recordings had been obtained through a federal investigation that had been running parallel to the current state case. The conversations clearly showed coordination between political operatives and donors in an effort to hide the true sources of campaign contributions. The defense immediately objected to the admission of the recordings, arguing that they had been obtained without proper warrants and that their use in state court proceedings was inappropriate. Judge Whitfield found herself at the center of a complex legal debate about evidence admissibility, federal versus state jurisdiction, and the proper procedures for handling politically sensitive information. As the legal arguments continued, Judge Whitfield became increasingly aware that her decisions in this case would have implications far beyond the immediate defendants. The recordings, if admitted, would likely lead to additional investigations and potentially criminal charges against other political figures who were not currently defendants in the case. The afternoon session brought even more dramatic developments when one of the key witnesses unexpectedly changed his testimony. Under cross-examination by the defense, he admitted that some of his earlier statements had been inaccurate and that he had been under pressure from federal investigators to provide information that would support their case against the defendants. This revelation created a storm of activity in the courtroom. The prosecution requested an immediate recess to confer with their witness, while the defense demanded that all of his testimony be struck from the record. Judge Whitfield found herself in the difficult position of determining how to handle this unexpected development while maintaining the integrity of the proceedings. As news of the witnesses' changed testimony spread beyond the courtroom, the media coverage intensified even further. Legal analysts were debating the implications of the development, and political commentators were speculating about how it might affect the broader investigation into campaign finance violations. Judge Whitfield was beginning to sense that there were forces at work in this case that went beyond the typical legal and procedural challenges she normally encountered. The combination of federal and state investigations, high-profile defendants, and intense media scrutiny was creating a complex environment where every decision carried significant risks and potential consequences. Late in the afternoon, the prosecution made an unexpected request for a sealed hearing to discuss what they described as sensitive national security implications of the case. This request caught everyone by surprise, including Judge Whitfield, who had not been previously informed that national security issues might be involved in what had appeared to be a straightforward campaign finance case. The defense immediately objected to any sealed proceedings, arguing that their clients had a right to a public trial and that closing the courtroom would be inappropriate and potentially unconstitutional. They suggested that the prosecution was attempting to introduce prejudicial information that would not be admissible under normal circumstances. Judge Whitfield found herself facing one of the most difficult decisions of her career. The request for sealed proceedings was highly unusual, and she was not entirely clear about the legal standards that should apply. At the same time, the prosecution's mention of national security implications suggested that there might be aspects of the case that had not been previously disclosed. As the day drew to a close, Judge Whitfield announced that she would need time to research the legal issues surrounding sealed proceedings and national security implications. She scheduled a brief recess to allow all parties to submit written briefs addressing these complex questions. The courtroom slowly emptied as reporters rushed to file their stories about the day's dramatic developments. The witnesses changed testimony. The prosecution's request for sealed proceedings and the defense's constitutional objections had created a complex legal situation that would require careful consideration and research. Judge Whitfield remained in her chambers long after the courtroom had cleared, researching precedents and consulting with legal databases about similar cases. She was acutely aware that her decisions over the next few days would likely be subject to intense scrutiny and potential appeal, regardless of which direction she chose to go. The intersection of politics, law, and national security was creating unprecedented challenges that would test her legal knowledge, judicial temperament, and professional integrity in ways she had never experienced before. The third day of proceedings began with an atmosphere of heightened tension that was palpable throughout the courthouse. Judge Whitfield had spent the previous evening researching the complex legal issues surrounding sealed proceedings and national security implications, but she was still uncertain about the best path forward. The case was becoming increasingly complicated, with new developments emerging almost hourly. As she entered the courtroom, Judge Whitfield noticed that the media presence had grown even larger. National television networks had set up permanent broadcasting positions outside the courthouse, and legal analysts were providing continuous commentary on the developments. The public interest in the case had reached levels that she had never experienced in her career. The morning session began with the prosecution's formal presentation of their request for sealed proceedings. Their attorney, a seasoned federal prosecutor who had been specially assigned to the case, presented arguments that the evidence they needed to introduce contained sensitive information that could potentially compromise ongoing federal investigations into related matters. The prosecutor's arguments were carefully constructed and legally sound, but they also raised troubling questions about the scope of the case and the extent to which federal authorities were involved in what had initially appeared to be a state-level campaign finance violation. Judge Whitfield found herself questioning whether she had been fully informed about all aspects of the case from the beginning. The defense response was swift and forceful. Their lead attorney, a constitutional law expert with an impressive track record in high-profile cases, argued that sealed proceedings would violate their client's fundamental right to a public trial. He contended that the prosecution was attempting to introduce prejudicial information in a way that would prevent effective cross-examination and public scrutiny. As the legal arguments continued, Judge Whitfield became increasingly aware that she was being placed in an impossible position. Regardless of her decision, one side or the other would likely appeal, and the case would become embroiled in lengthy appellate proceedings that could drag on for years. During a brief recess, Judge Whitfield was informed that several prominent legal scholars had filed amicus briefs with the court, offering their perspectives on the constitutional and procedural issues at stake. The level of outside interest in the case was unprecedented, and it was clear that her decisions would be subject to intense academic and legal scrutiny. When the session resumed, the prosecution presented additional evidence that they claimed supported their request for sealed proceedings. This evidence included documents and communications that allegedly showed connections between the defendants and foreign entities, raising questions about potential violations of laws governing foreign influence in American elections. The introduction of foreign influence allegations transformed the case once again, adding new layers of complexity and potential criminal liability. Judge Whitfield realized that what had begun as a relatively straightforward campaign finance case had evolved into something that potentially involved multiple federal agencies, foreign governments, and complex national security considerations. Brem. Defense immediately challenged the new allegations, arguing that they were beyond the scope of the original charges and that introducing them at this stage of the proceedings was both inappropriate and prejudicial. They demanded that any evidence related to foreign influence be excluded from the current case and referred to appropriate federal authorities for separate investigation. As the arguments continued, Judge Whitfield found herself struggling to maintain control of the proceedings. The case was evolving so rapidly and in so many directions that it was becoming difficult to determine what was relevant to the original charges and what constituted inappropriate expansion of the scope of the trial. The afternoon session brought yet another unexpected development when J.D. Vance's attorneys made a surprise appearance in the courtroom. They had not been previously involved in the case, as their client was not a named defendant, but they argued that the proceedings were directly affecting his reputation and political career and that he should be allowed to participate in the hearings. Judge Whitfield was caught off guard by this development. The request to allow non-parties to participate in sealed proceeding discussions was highly unusual, and she was not sure what legal standards should apply. The situation was becoming increasingly complex, with multiple parties, competing interests, and unclear jurisdictional boundaries. The prosecution objected to allowing Vance's attorneys to participate, arguing that he was not a party to the case, and that his interests were not directly at stake in the current proceedings. They suggested that any concerns he might have could be addressed through separate legal channels and should not be allowed to complicate the current case. The defense, surprisingly, supported the prosecution's position on this issue, arguing that allowing additional parties to participate would further complicate an already complex case and could potentially delay proceedings indefinitely. They suggested that the focus should remain on the original defendants and charges. As the day progressed, Judge Whitfield found herself facing what appeared to be an impossible situation. The case had evolved far beyond anything she had anticipated, involving multiple jurisdictions, complex constitutional issues, and high-profile political figures who were not directly involved in the proceedings, but whose interests were clearly affected by the outcome. The media coverage was becoming increasingly intense, with legal commentators offering competing interpretations of the developments and political analysts speculating about the broader implications for upcoming elections and ongoing investigations. Judge Whitfield was acutely aware that every decision she made would be subject to immediate and intense scrutiny. Late in the afternoon, she announced that she would need additional time to consider all of the complex legal issues that had been raised. She scheduled a continuance for the following week, allowing all parties to submit additional briefs and giving herself time to consult with other judges and legal experts about the unprecedented situation she was facing. The decision to grant a continuance was met with mixed reactions. Some observers praised her caution and thoroughness, while others criticized what they saw as indecision in the face of clear legal principles. The media coverage was predictably intense, with various commentators offering competing interpretations of her decision and its implications. As Judge Whitfield left the courthouse that evening, she was surrounded by reporters seeking comments about the day's developments. She declined to speak, maintaining her usual policy of not commenting on ongoing cases outside of formal court proceedings. However, she was acutely aware that her silence was itself being interpreted and analyzed by the media and public observers. The week-long continuance had given Judge Whitfield time to thoroughly research the complex legal issues, but it had also allowed public pressure and media speculation to intensify to unprecedented levels. When court reconvened, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Political commentators, legal experts, and ordinary citizens were all eager to see how she would navigate the increasingly complicated situation. Judge Whitfield had spent the intervening days consulting with constitutional law experts, reviewing hundreds of relevant cases, and carefully considering the various legal and ethical implications of her potential decisions. She had also been subjected to unprecedented pressure from various sources, including phone calls from political figures, letters from legal organizations, and even veiled threats from unknown individuals. As she entered the courtroom that Monday morning, Judge Whitfield was determined to cut through the complexity and focus on the core legal issues. She had prepared a carefully worded statement that would address the major procedural questions while attempting to maintain the integrity of the judicial process. The prosecution began the session by presenting additional evidence that they claimed justified their request for sealed proceedings. This new evidence included intercepted communications between some of the defendants and what they described as foreign agents, as well as financial records showing suspicious international money transfers that seemed designed to circumvent campaign finance reporting requirements. However, Judge Whitfield had done her homework during the continuance. She had discovered several procedural irregularities in how the evidence had been obtained and processed. The federal authorities who had provided some of the evidence had apparently not followed proper protocols for sharing information with state courts, and there were questions about whether some of the surveillance activities had been conducted under appropriate legal authority. When the defense had their opportunity to respond, they presented a comprehensive challenge to the admissibility of much of the evidence. Their research during the continuance had uncovered similar procedural problems, and they argued that the entire federal investigation had been compromised by improper coordination between federal and state authorities. Judge Whitfield found herself in the unexpected position of having to question the fundamental validity of much of the prosecution's case. The evidence that had seemed so compelling just a week earlier was now subject to serious legal challenges that went to the heart of constitutional protections against improper searches and seizures. As the morning progressed, it became clear that the prosecution's case was in serious trouble. The procedural irregularities that had been uncovered during the continuance were more extensive than anyone had initially realized. Federal agents had apparently been sharing information with state prosecutors without proper warrants, and some of the surveillance activities had been conducted outside the scope of authorized investigations. The defense pressed their advantage, presenting evidence that the federal investigation had been politically motivated and that prosecutors had been under pressure to develop cases against specific political targets regardless of the strength of the evidence. They argued that their clients were victims of a coordinated campaign of political persecution that violated their constitutional rights. Judge Whitfield was stunned by these revelations. The case that had seemed so straightforward just weeks earlier was now revealed to be built on a foundation of questionable legal procedures and potentially improper political influence. She realized that she would need to make decisions that could effectively end the prosecution's case and potentially expose serious misconduct by federal authorities. During the lunch break, Judge Whitfield was approached by representatives from several legal organizations who had been monitoring the case. They expressed concern about the apparent procedural violations and urged her to take strong action to protect the integrity of the judicial process. The pressure was intense, but she was determined to base her decisions solely on legal principles and constitutional requirements. The afternoon session brought even more dramatic revelations when the defense presented evidence that federal prosecutors had been in regular communication with political operatives who had a clear interest in seeing the defendants convicted. The communications showed that prosecution strategies had been coordinated with political considerations rather than purely legal factors. These revelations created a firestorm in the courtroom. The prosecution attempted to argue that the communications were routine coordination between different levels of law enforcement, but the content of the messages clearly showed political motivations and considerations that went far beyond normal. Prosecutorial discretion. Judge Whitfield realized that she was facing one of the most serious cases of prosecutorial misconduct she had ever encountered. The evidence suggested that the entire investigation had been compromised by improper political influence and that the defendant's constitutional rights had been systematically violated throughout the process. As the day progressed, more evidence of misconduct continued to emerge. Federal agents had apparently been directed to target specific individuals for investigation, regardless of the evidence, and prosecutors had been pressured to develop cases that would support predetermined political narratives. The scope of the misconduct was staggering and went to the very heart of the American legal system. The media coverage of these developments was intense and immediate. Legal commentators were calling it one of the most serious cases of prosecutorial misconduct in modern American history, and political observers were speculating about the broader implications for ongoing investigations and future elections. Judge Whitfield found herself at the center of a constitutional crisis that threatened to undermine public confidence in the legal system itself. She realized that her decisions over the next few days would have implications that went far beyond the immediate case and could potentially affect the fundamental relationship between law enforcement and political processes. Late in the afternoon, she announced that she would need additional time to consider the serious constitutional issues that had been raised. She scheduled another brief continuance, but this time it was clear that she was preparing to make decisions that would likely result in dramatic changes to the case. The prosecution team appeared stunned by the developments. They had apparently been unaware of the extent of the procedural violations and political interference that had compromised their case. Their carefully constructed legal strategy was crumbling in the face of evidence that the entire investigation had been tainted by improper political influence. As Judge Whitfield left the courthouse that evening, she was surrounded by an even larger crowd of reporters than usual. The developments of the day had attracted national attention, and legal experts from across the country were offering commentary on the unprecedented situation. However, she maintained her policy of not commenting on ongoing cases, despite the intense pressure to provide some indication of her thinking about the complex issues involved. The morning of what would become one of the most consequential days in Judge Whitfield's career began with an unexpected phone call. Her clerk informed her that the courthouse had received over 300 calls from reporters, legal organizations, and political figures, all seeking information about her pending decision. The intense public interest had reached levels that were completely unprecedented in her experience. As she prepared for court that morning, Judge Whitfield reflected on the dramatic transformation that had occurred in just a few weeks. What had begun as what appeared to be a routine campaign finance case had evolved into a constitutional crisis that was testing the very foundations of the American legal system. The evidence of prosecutorial misconduct and political interference had created a situation that demanded decisive action. When she entered the courtroom, Judge Whitfield was immediately struck by the tension in the air. The prosecution team appeared nervous and uncertain, clearly aware that their case was in serious jeopardy. The defense attorneys, in contrast, seemed confident and prepared for what they expected would be a favorable outcome. Judge Whitfield had spent the previous evening preparing a comprehensive ruling that would address all of the constitutional and procedural issues that had been raised. Her decision was based on extensive research and consultation with legal experts, and she was confident that it was both legally sound and necessary to protect the integrity of the judicial process. However, before she could begin her prepared remarks, something unexpected happened that would change everything. As she was reviewing her notes one final time, her bailiff approached with an urgent message. Federal marshals were requesting an immediate meeting with her in chambers, claiming that they had critical information that could affect her pending decision. Judge Whitfield was initially reluctant to meet with federal agents while court was in session, but the marshals insisted that the information they possessed was both time-sensitive and directly relevant to the constitutional issues she was preparing to address. After conferring with her clerk and court reporter, she agreed to a brief recess to hear what they had to say. What the federal marshals revealed in her chambers was shocking and completely unexpected. They presented evidence that the defense attorneys had been in communication with foreign intelligence services and had been receiving information and guidance that was designed to undermine the American legal system. The marshals claimed that the defense's revelations about prosecutorial misconduct were part of a sophisticated foreign influence operation. The evidence presented by the marshals included intercepted communications, financial records, and intelligence. Reports that suggested a coordinated effort to manipulate American legal proceedings for foreign political purposes. According to their information, the defense team's apparently damaging revelations about prosecutorial misconduct had been orchestrated as part of a broader campaign to undermine public confidence in American institutions. Judge Whitfield was stunned by these allegations. If true, they would completely change her understanding of the case and the motivations of the various parties involved. However, she was also deeply suspicious of the timing of these revelations and the apparent coordination between federal authorities and the prosecution team. The marshals urged her to delay her ruling, while federal authorities conducted a more thorough investigation of the alleged foreign influence operation. They argued that proceeding with her planned decision could potentially compromise national security and play into the hands of foreign adversaries who were seeking to destabilize American democratic institutions. Judge Whitfield found herself facing an impossible situation. The evidence of prosecutorial misconduct that had been presented by the defense was compelling and appeared to be well documented. However, the marshals' allegations about foreign influence raised serious questions about the motivations behind those revelations and the integrity of the defense team itself. After careful consideration, Judge Whitfield decided to return to the courtroom and proceed with her planned ruling. She was deeply troubled by the marshals' allegations, but she concluded that they did not change the fundamental constitutional issues at stake in the case. The evidence of prosecutorial misconduct needed to be addressed regardless of the motivations of those who had brought it to light. When she returned to the courtroom, Judge Whitfield could see that word of the federal marshal's visit had somehow leaked to the media. Reporters were sending urgent text messages, and there was a palpable sense of anticipation about what she would say. The atmosphere was electric, with tension and expectation. Judge Whitfield began her ruling by addressing the fundamental constitutional principles at stake in the case. She explained that the integrity of the judicial process depended on strict adherence to procedural safeguards and constitutional protections, regardless of political considerations or the identity of the defendants involved. She then systematically reviewed the evidence of prosecutorial misconduct that had been presented during the proceedings. The violations were extensive and serious, including improper coordination between federal and state authorities, political interference in prosecutorial decision-making, and systematic violations of the defendant's constitutional rights. As she continued her ruling, Judge Whitfield could see the prosecution team becoming increasingly uncomfortable. It was clear that she was preparing to take dramatic action that would likely result in the dismissal of most, if not all, of the charges against the defendants. However, just as she was preparing to announce her decision on the admissibility of the evidence, another unexpected interruption occurred. Her clerk approached the bench with an urgent message that had just been delivered by a federal courier. The message was from the Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court, requesting that she suspend her proceedings pending review of the case by a special judicial panel. The request from the state's highest court created yet another layer of complexity in an already unprecedented situation. Judge Whitfield realized that powerful forces were working behind the scenes to influence the outcome of the case, and that her decisions were having implications far beyond what she had initially anticipated. The courtroom erupted in confusion and speculation as news of the Chief Justice's intervention spread among the observers. Legal experts were unsure about the procedural implications of such an intervention, and political commentators were speculating about the behind-the-scenes negotiations that must have been taking place. Judge Whitfield announced a brief recess to consider the Chief Justice's request and consult with her legal staff about the proper procedures for responding to such an unusual situation. The case had become so complex and politically charged that normal legal procedures seemed inadequate to address all of the competing interests and constitutional concerns involved. The final moments of Judge Whitfield's handling of the case would prove to be the most dramatic and consequential of her entire career. After consulting with her legal staff about the Chief Justice's intervention, she had discovered something that would completely change her understanding of the situation and her own role in the complex legal and political drama that had been unfolding. Her research into the procedural aspects of the Chief Justice's request had led her to examine the administrative records of the case more carefully. What she found was shocking and completely unexpected. There were clear indications that her assignment to the case had not been random, as she had initially believed, but had been specifically orchestrated by unknown parties who had anticipated the complex constitutional issues that would arise. The evidence suggested that powerful interests had been manipulating the case from the very beginning, using their influence to ensure that specific judges would be assigned to hear specific aspects of the proceedings. Judge Whitfield realized that she had been selected not for her legal expertise or judicial temperament, but because her known political views and previous decisions made her a predictable choice for handling the case in a particular way. This revelation was devastating to Judge Whitfield, who had always prided herself on her independence and integrity. The realization that she had been manipulated and used as part of a larger political strategy was both personally humiliating and professionally damaging. She understood that her reputation and credibility were now in serious jeopardy. As she prepared to return to the courtroom for what she knew would be her final session on the case, Judge Whitfield made a decision that would surprise everyone involved. Instead of proceeding with her planned ruling or acceding to the Chief Justice's request for suspension, she decided to take a completely different approach that no one had anticipated. When she returned to the packed courtroom, Judge Whitfield began by acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the case and the complex constitutional issues it had raised. She explained that the proceedings had revealed serious problems with the American legal system that went far beyond the specific charges against the defendants. She then did something that stunned everyone present. Instead of ruling on the evidence or the various procedural motions, she announced that she was recusing herself from the case due to what she described as systemic conflicts of interest and institutional pressures that make it impossible to ensure a fair and impartial proceeding. The courtroom erupted in chaos as reporters rushed to file breaking news stories, and legal observers tried to understand the implications of her decision. Judge Whitfield's recusal was completely unexpected and created an immediate crisis for all parties involved in the case. But Judge Whitfield was not finished. In a statement that would be replayed countless times in the coming weeks, she delivered a scathing critique of the entire legal and political system that had created the situation she was now abandoning. She spoke about the corrupting influence of political pressure on judicial decision-making, the manipulation of legal procedures for partisan advantage, and the erosion of public trust in American institutions. Her statement was particularly critical of what she described as the weaponization of the legal system for political purposes. She argued that both federal and state authorities had abandoned their commitment to impartial justice in favor of achieving predetermined political outcomes. The damage to the rule of law, she argued, was far more serious than any individual case or political scandal. Judge Whitfield also addressed the media coverage of the case, criticizing what she saw as sensationalized reporting that prioritized political drama over serious legal analysis. She argued that the constant media pressure and speculation had made it impossible to conduct fair and impartial proceedings, regardless of the merits of the various legal arguments involved. As her statement continued, Judge Whitfield revealed additional information about the behind-the-scenes pressures she had faced during the case. She described phone calls from political figures, pressure from legal organizations, and even threats from unknown individuals who clearly had strong interests in the outcome of the proceedings. The most shocking revelation came when Judge Whitfield announced that she had decided to refer the entire matter to federal authorities for investigation of potential obstruction of justice and corruption of the legal process. She argued that the evidence of systematic manipulation and political interference was so extensive that it required investigation by authorities who were independent of the state judicial system. Her decision to make these referrals created an immediate political firestorm. Within hours of her statement, political figures from both parties were issuing statements either praising her courage or criticizing her decision to abandon her judicial responsibilities. Legal experts were divided about whether her recusal was appropriate or represented an abdication of her judicial duties. The media coverage was intense and immediate. Judge Whitfield's statement was being analyzed and debated on every major news network, and legal commentators were struggling to understand the full implications of her decisions. The case that had begun as a routine campaign finance matter had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the intersection of law and politics in America. Within hours of Judge Whitfield's dramatic recusal and referral, the political consequences began to unfold rapidly. J.D. Vance, who had been mentioned throughout the proceedings but had never been formally charged, issued a statement through his attorneys expressing vindication and calling for a complete investigation of what he described as a politically motivated witch hunt designed to destroy conservative political figures. The prosecution team found themselves in complete disarray. Their carefully constructed case had collapsed not because of the evidence against the defendants, but because of revelations about their own conduct and the broader institutional pressures that had compromised the entire proceeding. Several prosecutors immediately requested transfers to other assignments, and rumors began circulating about potential disciplinary actions. The defendants, who had been facing serious criminal charges, just hours earlier, suddenly found themselves in a completely transformed legal landscape. Their attorneys announced that they would be seeking dismissal of all charges with prejudice. arguing that the systematic misconduct revealed during the proceedings made it impossible for their clients to receive fair treatment in any future. Legal proceedings. The Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court, whose intervention had been one of the final catalysts for Judge Whitfield's decision, issued a brief statement acknowledging the unprecedented circumstances and announcing the formation of a special commission to investigate the institutional failures that had been revealed during the case. Federal authorities, who had been operating in the background throughout much of the case, found themselves under intense scrutiny as details of their coordination with state prosecutors became public. Congressional oversight committees announced immediate investigations, and several high-ranking federal officials were placed on administrative leave pending review of their roles in the controversial investigation. The political implications extended far beyond the immediate participants in the case. Opposition political figures called for broader investigations of federal law enforcement agencies and their role in what they described as politically motivated prosecutions. Supporters of the original investigation argued that Judge Whitfield's decision represented a victory for corruption and a defeat for accountability. Legal scholars and constitutional experts struggled to place Judge Whitfield's actions within existing frameworks for judicial conduct and constitutional law. Some praised her courage in exposing systematic abuse of the legal system, while others criticized her for abandoning her judicial responsibilities and potentially compromising ongoing legal proceedings. In the weeks that followed, Judge Whitfield became a controversial figure in American legal and political circles. She received both praise and criticism from across the political spectrum, with some viewing her as a principled defender of judicial integrity and others seeing her as someone who had failed to fulfill her basic judicial responsibilities under pressure. The long-term consequences of the case continued to unfold over the following months. Federal investigations into the systematic manipulation of legal proceedings led to indictments of several high-ranking officials, while state judicial reform efforts resulted in new procedures designed to prevent political interference in court. Proceedings J.D. Vance, whose political career had seemed threatened by the initial allegations, found his position strengthened by the dramatic collapse of the case against him. He used the experience to argue for broader reforms of federal law enforcement agencies and became a leading voice for investigating what he described as the deep state manipulation of legal proceedings for political purposes. Judge Whitfield herself faced a complex mixture of consequences for her dramatic decision. While she received significant support from legal reform advocates and civil liberties organizations, she also faced criticism from judicial conduct authorities, who questioned whether her recusal and public statements had been appropriate under existing ethical guidelines. The case ultimately became a watershed moment in discussions about the relationship between law and politics in America. It highlighted the dangers of political interference in judicial proceedings while also raising important questions about how judges should respond when they become aware of systematic institutional failures. Years later, legal scholars would continue to debate the lessons and implications of the case. Judge Whitfield's decision to abandon her judicial role, rather than participate in what she viewed as a corrupted process, would be studied as either a principled stand for judicial integrity or a dangerous precedent that could undermine the stability of legal institutions. The ultimate irony was that a case that had begun with allegations of campaign finance violations had ended by exposing far more serious problems with the fundamental integrity of American legal and political institutions. Judge Whitfield's dramatic intervention had prevented what she viewed as a miscarriage of justice, but it had also revealed the extent to which the system itself had been compromised by political pressures and institutional failures.